So thank you for everyone that's attending our last TEK seminar of the semester. It's been a great seminar all semester. Today we're going to have two speakers, Dr. Stephen Langdon and Dr. Richard Meyers. First, we'll have Dr. Stephen Langdon, who is a Professor Emeritus of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alaska-Anchorage, where he taught from 1976 until 2014. He obtained his doctorate in anthropology from Stanford in 1977. He has specialized in Southeast Alaska on topics related to pre-contact, historic, and contemporary fisheries of the Tlingit and Haida people. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we're strapped on time, but I really appreciate you being here, Stephen, and I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Oh no, it's midday where you're at. Well, sorry I won't be able to make eye contact or be present. I'd like to thank Ty for the invitation, and it's an extremely important topic. My background is I've spent over 50 years working with the Tlingit people of southeastern Alaska on a wide variety of matters that were touched upon, some of which can be classed as Indigenous knowledge. I'm not going to belabor the TEK term at this juncture, but I'm sure you've had opportunities to debate the limitations of that particular concept as articulated. So I'm going to talk today about, I wanted to talk a little bit about methods, so embedded in here will be methods, but I'm going to range across particularly relationships in regard to salmon will be the central thesis, because the Tlingit of southeastern Alaska are a population that been in place archaeologically and linguistically evident for 5,000 to 6,000 years at a minimum. They live in a temperate rainforest, which is characterized by high rainfall patterns. And that rainfall produces a rich, luxuriant forest, as well as numerous streams and rivers that support the anadromous salmon species that return every summer and fall and lay their eggs and then go out to the ocean. So that's the central foodstuff of the people, but they make other uses of marine resources and some terrestrial resources as well. In the comments that you'll see as following and materials I'll be presenting will be primarily derived from, as you see on the screen, the Hinya-Kwan territory in the southern part of Tlingit region, but I have worked across the entirety of the region, and we'll reference some of those other areas as well during that time. I'd like to pay great gratitude and my indebtedness to the mentors, teachers, and friends who have provided me with enormous patience and time in sharing with me and providing me opportunities to learn from them about the depth and the ways of the Tlingit people. So one of the central things that you need in any approach to these understandings is an understanding of the fundamental philosophies and beliefs of the people. And as I have encountered these things over 50 years, I've come to the notion of what is an existence-scape. Too many people live in what I would call modes of naive realities, which is that everyone experiences the same things. And that's a misrepresentation. And existence-scapes asks this question: what is it possible to think and do within this particular context? So entities, some of which we are aware and some not, are constantly in flux in time and space through processes and interactions of reproduction and transformation. Through these processes and events, humans receive and create a stream of sensations. Sensations are interpreted through both physiological and cognitive processes and given linguistic labels. Constructions of meaning, the basis of much behavior, arise through the mediated process that rely on concepts and understandings that are learned and are the basis for creative engagements, both social and environmental. The language structure, a very important item to look at in terms of the framing of these understandings, uh, is important to conveying the critical concepts and underlying beliefs. So therefore, an existence state comprised the realm of possible understandings, behaviors, and created responses given a set of core cosmological and ontological principles. Existence-scapes become embodied habitus, a term from the French philosopher Bourdieu. Habitus, that is, as you can see, reflects on the concept of habit, which are shared with other members of a cultural group, allowing for critical understandings to be circulated and made a part of the everyday acceptance. The Tlingit existence scape is one of willful, interdependent beings. As Julie Cruikshank observed, the Tlingit, quote, occupy a moral universe inhabited by a community of beings in constant communication and exchange. And it is in these constant relationships that we derive. This is fundamental principle is one of relationality. That is one being in relationship with another. That is a critical framing construct in the existence scape. So that leads to a relational cosmology. We see in the core philosophical myths regarding Raven or Yel, with regard to the appearance of existence as we know it, that this is a relationship that goes on between Raven and human counterparts in creating the circumstances of existence. So the ontologies, which I'll get to here shortly, is established in the Salmon Boy, which is a mythic charter covenant, which provides the basis for understanding how relationships with salmon are to be conducted. Knowledge is built out of relationality in the engagements with each other. And phenomenology is an orientation to constantly be aware of relationships, of looking for the contexts and being apprised. Ultimately, the philosophy in this particular existence scape is one of relational sustainability. And that is, this is an interdependent necessary. And I would point to the work of Greg Kahete, which my work strongly dovetails with regard to his concept of native science, the laws of interdependence as indigenous ways. And this then constitute the appropriate ways of behavior for existence as is understood within the Tlingit world to continue. So it's important to set up a couple of juxtapositions to escape then from naive realities. First of all, one of the shared aspects is that there are these connections between domains of existence. And that means that we have what is called obligations. And through those obligations, these particular relations will be sustained. So this is a relational ontology, and the continuation of existence depends on relational principles of mutual benefit and reciprocal obligation. It is not theistic. It has not been created by a God, and it is not directed by God's commandments. It is not materialistic in that it does not have a core material principle of sustainability, but it is a spiritual sustainability. And one of the core principles I've mentioned, relationality is one of the crucial principles. The spiritual being is a second important being. Those beings are all attentive, sentient, and volitional. And the third one is that this cosmological cycling, and that is the relational sustainability. So in other words, this is the framework by which Tlingit then, in my understanding and estimation, see. Here, one passes through a lived existence at the bottom of the line. At the point of death, one enters another world, and through appropriate ritual and ceremonial behaviors, one then comes around and is reborn. A spirit is returned. And so you will see, particularly when I talk about the mythic covenant of the Salmon Boy story, how this particular propositions are put into motion. This is the covenant. This is a depiction recently made as part of our work at Sea Alaska Heritage Institute. This is called the Salmon Boy story. This is the mythic charter and covenant between the Tlingit people that is passed down. When I asked in my research elders to say, what did you learn about salmon? Invariably, this some portion of this account was provided to me.
Chakawe ha'in kadusnik you kicks adi at gutskudat. We kick lucky out the dust. Oh, not seeing you do a sock you at gutsku. A shoot nails good away. A eat yon uaha. A clay. Hard yon uaha. A trishi ach cheat te. A cheat our tea. A shanya woody cloch. Ja kade ke our kick. They are sika. Ja shanya kutlach ach itich nooch. A day I was kai ye chwe. You had kwanich aya kutlikat. You take a two hoet a yaw do a car. He does a ye. A walk to a good kate. Heen huji kich. You das a yika, you at Katsko. Heen deo do a hoot cardlane there. Ah, doch cowdy, ah. Het would dus coach a cook sa ye. Ah, you had kwane are you ye a shwoo see ne. Ak tat sin koa. Had kwanich a skiu woo see ne. Hastu an de anda kas yawa ah. Yak yach a shwa ki ye kutiyen. Tlingit yach a shwak she ye you had kwane. Na kahitki atasla a du ani kwani yachyati. You an kau askiu hat hunach yat aswusliech. Chutla aye wuti achu hat kwani ane. You an kau ash I ausli tu hastu kusti yidat. Au shu gug a deu du sne ye yat wunetin. Tletsu kuchte has jou de guwu sak ahaswu de chi de yede. Chun tak soe has tu chuk yeyeti. Wanene soe at kua ha shagat at wudu a chun has tu hini de. You chat an kau yech ayaka. Dak ye se tak hayak ko. Tlach na she. Ayaw du a ha. Why kuna yat sawa? Ya du ka kasini what do le ha? Chke! Oh, get the han! Ye ya du te ka. Ya yak nach woody han. A ka du kla a tinyo ya ke ha ke utani. How? To our ik du kla. Hat kadan! Du eistioe tagal in our shot. Doch du tlajit au sita. Du tlaj gukacha she awe we hat. Ayawa tin du yid ek kateke. Anjus has du naku gudi. Achayet tlet au chash we hat. Ku ashtat skau du tlik what? Ya kena a awetsa. Chayis kahu siti. Akutat sin hochudi gut. Akutat sin kashukawa ja al deudus ne ye you hat ye kayaka. Hes ade kuch dahin ye kusti hya atwurne. To hes the cut a hoho yeudus ne ye. Su icha ti stakat at hinde ye nasne. Jay daddy de akutat sin chayahawe Yesu hot kuchwudi hinch. Ka iti ka kage yis. Ye ya kakwage yashkafnik.
This then is the covenant and the charter that young people learn, and it organizes their behavior and in their habitus, their response. It resonates. It bounces throughout the culture over and over in many ways. You heard in the story, the mother saying, "Eh ha." That's carried down to Tlingit today when they see salmon jump out of the water. They give that cry out. It's a cry of affirmation. It's a cry of welcome to them. I first thought it meant, oh, the salmon is jumping. No, it is related to this covenant and the principles that are embedded. You saw within the video, you probably didn't attend, there's a picture of a house front. And that picture is taken from that was inserted in the video is from an actual house front and from a village called Tuxacan, in which that image is said to be the image that Aquatatsin saw when he was in the Salmon people's village. So that resonance of being with the Salmon people in a house is brought into the living world of the people themselves. And finally, this particular examination here, which I find so extraordinary, on the left, you see the carved object. It's a stake. It's a trap stake, as it's referred to. And that means that it was found in association with a salmon fish trap at the mouth of a stream. And you can see by how the trap stake is located that it sits above the water. So you immediately ask the question then, well, sitting above the water, what is it there for? Well, it's there for those salmon that are jumping to sea. And the question then is, what do they see? Well, what they see is a mythic representation of the salmon boy story. And so the Tlingit can provide that device to indicate to this returning salmon that they understand the principles by which they are to be treated, and they will do so. But it's not merely a device of communication, it's also a gift of aesthetic wonder, because it is indeed an extraordinary, beautiful object, which is also a part of how in your relational principles of behavior, you engage in these exchanges through gifts of beauty. So this constitutes one of the means by which underlying relationships with salmon to produce relational sustainability are passed down through generations. One of the interesting research vectors of my career is the examination of intertidal fish traps. And this particular one that you see depicted here is of the quality of made of stone, semicircular arcs, and they're made at the mouths of streams. And so what that makes possible is tidal pulse fishing. And you'll see how these operate here in the next couple of slides. What's important to remember is that salmon have to get upstream to be able to lay their eggs. This is an example of one, and in fact is the one in which the drone video that you will see hopefully shortly demonstrates. So this is how the fish traps worked. And that, in fact, is the one that you just saw pictures, the one that is depicted. On the islands west of Klawock, Alaska, the Tlingits traditionally utilized a different technology for capturing salmon. The same concepts of intertidal pulse fishing as found in the Klawock estuary were used here, but with different materials. On these rocky beaches, they built stone walls in the form of a semicircular arc, typically in the middle of the intertidal zone. By piling the stones on top of each other, they would create structures that salmon could swim over when the tide rose, but would trap salmon as the tide fell. They built these traps near streams where salmon would spawn. As salmon came in, they could go over the trap walls that would be completely underwater at high tide to lay their eggs in the gravel spawning beds. As the tide went out, some of the salmon would get caught behind the trap walls. These salmon were gathered by people from the nearby village who built and used the traps. At the lowest point of the stone arc, the fishermen positioned a circular wooden basket trap at a gap in the stone wall. As the tide ebbed, salmon would be captured in the basket trap. Water remained in the stone trap when the tide was out. Salmon that stayed in the trap could escape on the next tide if the people did not take them. Tlingit knowledge of patterns of salmon migration as they return to their streams is demonstrated by the intertidal stone traps built at Fern Point. Salmon from many streams migrated together from the ocean in large schools through island channels towards their streams. The Tlingit observed that these large schools moved near shore as they passed by Fern Point, prior to separating as they got closer to their home stream. This behavior created a unique opportunity to capture them. The Tlingit knew that tides varied from extreme high tide to extreme low tide depending on the time of month and year. They built their traps at different levels in the intertidal zone to use all the various tidal patterns to capture salmon that passed by Fern Point. At Fern Point, Tlingit people could begin catching abundant quantities of salmon a week or two before the salmon arrived in their spawning streams. Tlingit developed deep understandings of salmon over centuries of observation and interaction. It was this knowledge and its use that made it possible for the Tlingit people to sustain their rich culture in the Klawock region. I'd like to make a point about my encountering with those particular those technologies, and to talk about a method of triangulation. Those particular patterns are no longer in use, and they are no longer part of the oral tradition and cultural heritage. Only by piecing together these other pieces in the account that you'll see was I able to discern what was going here. But triangulation, I went to the the superintendent of the local cannery, and I asked him. They used to have their own white man's type fish traps, which were nets that were set on points. And I asked him, did you ever have any traps in this area? And he said, he pointed to the first point below there, and he said, we had a trap there that was our most productive trap that we ever had. So this clearly then was a point of triangulation and understanding how the Tlingit had built and constructed that knowledge, and following from that knowledge, those particular technologies. Now, in this particular video, this shows the importance of place-based as a methodology to understand these things. This is one of my dearest friends and elders who will explain how he, as a child, was involved. The last person known, in my estimation, to have been able to participate with these technologies. Tell us about this place and when you came here as a young man. Tell us about what you did here.
it must have been around 1929.
You're about 4 or 5 years old?
That's 22.
Oh.
7 years old.
7 years old, uh-huh.
Get your memory pretty good by that then.
Uh-huh.
They have no saying, if we know that. There's no saying. This is how they got their winter food from keeping what they're gonna dry. It used to be plentiful. Each family used to dry 400 dog salmon per family.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived out of potatoes and fish and dried fish. That is all their meal. But this is where one of the places where they got it from, right here. Dog salmon, what they put up. So when I remember that I could see that fish, a whole bunch of fish swimming around. They're coming through there, see. And that's where we throw our rocks right here. See? Just keep them in.
You guys were all along down there by that high point? Is that?
Yeah, this is high, so
okay.
Once they get in the air, you know you're not going to get away. But you keep them from that going down because it's kind of low, so the fish could come in.
Oh, I see. So you're over there throwing the rocks this way?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're standing on both sides throwing rocks.
Uh-huh.
On one side, it's throwing rocks. You keep them away from that kind of a low spot.
Yeah.
Until the tide goes down.
Okay, so you're keeping them in this area.
Yeah.
Show us how high you think the wall was at that time.
It's even I'd say about a good 3 feet. It's all deep, just tore it down.
Uh-huh.
That's a long time, in 1929.
Yeah. But so this was all a wall built up about that high then, about 3 feet, you're saying?
About 3 feet, the whole word.
Mm-hmm.
This is one spot, is where the salmon come in.
Yeah. And this is the one where you used. You didn't use the one behind us in that time, huh?
No, I'll remember just this one.
Just inside this one right here at that time. And who was it that brought you here?
I know our grandfather takes us. He's the one that brought us out.
And what was his name?
Frank Williams,
Frank
grandfather's brother.
Your grandfather's brother.
Yeah.
But you're not David Robertson's brother.
No.
You're right. Your mother's brother. Uh-huh. So how many people did he bring with him when you folks came out?
I'd say about 20, just a woman, few men, and a whole bunch of kids. This is sort of off.
Okay, and all the kids. And so where were you guys lined up? Right over there?
Yes, some here, and just to keep them from that low spot, just keep them on this side.
Uh-huh. And so Frank Williams told you to keep throwing rocks?
Yeah, and that is our job. Otherwise, I don't know. We couldn't stop throwing until the tide goes down.
And then when the tide went down, where were the fish?
They're all inside.
Show me the spots where they were. All the way across here?
Yeah, they're all inside.
How many do you think you got that time?
I don't know. They got quite a bit.
They did. Would you say a couple hundred fish?
Big family. No, it's one family dries 400 fish.
Uh-huh.
Dry fish.
Uh-huh. So did you do this on more than one tide or just one tide?
Just had one tide. They got quite a bit. They had enough to work on.
Uh-huh. And so then you got the fish, and then what did you do with the fish? Did you take them out to the boat or what? Or did you work on them here?
They clean them first before they take them off.
Where did they clean them?
Just any place, right there.
Right in here?
Right close to the water.
Mm-hmm. Clean them, and then you put them in the skiffs and took them out to the boat? And did you take them back to Kloak to dry them?
That's where they had all their smoke out.
They took them back there, huh? Oh, done. A couple of interesting points I want to draw your attention to. The way that was our job, and this is a way that we see how Tlingit are structuring children into the activities. They are given responsibilities and to participate. The second thing is this story, the business of the throwing the rocks to keep the fish in the trap. When I showed this video to elders in another village, one of the ladies recalled that as a child, she remembered singing songs in ceremonies in which they talked about throwing rocks. So there these constant returns and opportunities to have these activities reinforced and rebrought into people's existence. I want to turn now to talk about a different thematic, and that's within, but still, it's built on this particular understanding is built upon the relational principles of how people interact and behave with regard to salmon and in the valuing of salmon. And this is a particular structure that's called an ish. And this was never articulated in any literature that I've ever seen, ethnographic, oral tradition, or otherwise. It is embedded within the aesthetic and the naming. But this is called an ish, and it came to my attention in the interviews when people would talk about an ish. They would not use any kind of English substitute to talk about this particular phenomena. And an ish is a deep pool. So Tlingit people, in going into the stream to make their harvests of salmon, would see the extraordinary efforts that the salmon are making, how they pass quickly through the riffles, and how then they confront the falls, and they have to get their energy. Well, the way they get their energy back is that they rest and rejuvenate in these deep pools. And that's where they would see the Tlingit people would see various behaviors. So an ish is a multiple dimensional concept that is woven through this understanding, this empathic engagement with salmon as beings that volitional, sentient, and existence. It is a site index. I'm not going to go through all of these principles that the ish provides, but as a site index, what that means is that Tlingit clans owned the streams. Their property was high. They have a hitsati and a hinsati responsible for ensuring that the protocols and covenants are upheld. So when one elder told me that when he went out with his grandfather to one of the streams, the grandfather would go ashore and he would go up to the first ish. And if the first ish was filled with salmon, then it would be okay to go ahead and begin the process of harvesting. But if there were no salmon yet in the ish, they would not take any from the intertidal area. So it operates at these multi levels. It's a harvesting location, a spawning location, and as you see, you'll see a site of modification. It's a location built on philosophical contemplation of existence of salmon and how we as humans relate to that existence. This is how the Tlingit would capture salmon from the ish. And here's my dear friend Thomas Mills using the gaff hook in an ish, and you'll begin to see at the bottom there's a process that I discovered by doing this place-based participant observation with Thomas. He has begun a process of what I call streamscaping. Streamscaping, he's put in those logs into this so that he can step onto those particular logs and use his gaff and be able to pick. It's very important that the Tlingit select specific fish, and that relates to another of their principles. As I watched and participated with Thomas doing that, what I discovered and looking at the fish that he took is that he took 3 males for every 1 female. And in the other interviews, the interviewee said we took mostly males. Think about that principle, 3 to 1. If you look in other biology, you'll find that there's all kinds of excess males, but that is not used in any kind of biological modeling of salmon or harvesting. But the Tlingits understood that and took them 3 to 1. Now, streamscaping occurred elsewhere. In this particular form of streamscaping with the semicircular pool was created by the trustees with the intent of expanding the amount of spawning area that was in the stream. Then as we walked down the river, we came to this ish. And this ish I could see was the pool, and I understood that's what it's there. But then as I was watching, Patrick Mills came up behind me and said to me, "We're not the first ones on this stream." And what they have done then is that they have taken the rocks from behind what is now a wall and they have moved them. And they've created this rock wall across the stream to in fact create the ish for the salmon to come to. This is all a part of this engagement and creating the possibilities for salmon at multiple levels. So this is an extraordinary example of streamscaping, is the creation of the form of the ish. And this is what then Walter Soboleff, one of the great philosophers, said about the ish. There were those who were knowledgeable about all kinds of subjects. This thing named ish, it was almost as if it were human. It was spoken to in that way, this ish. So the ish is also an entity, a spiritual being. And as that concept comes into English as a human being, they treated it with respect because they got their food from this place. And I won't go through the rest of this, but it represents then the way in which this particular phenomena resonates and is created as a concept within Tlingit thought. And it also, this is another important part of how within Tlingit aesthetics and representation are the locations in which it, once again, just like in the dance of the throwing of the rocks, the repetition and the reappearance of these forms constitutes ways of again, demonstrating aspects. This particular kutia, the name for totem pole, demonstrates and has on it an ish. And it is related to the the Bear clan, who at the top is holding the salmon, representing their responsibilities to protect the salmon, as well as their ownership of that particular stream. And then in this extraordinary construct, this is called Ishkahit, which means it's a house that represents a house by the hill. And we see a patterning of the, just like in the video, of the artwork that's on the house front. And the circle, again, is what is used in Tlingit art to represent the ish. And here you have the representation of the ish with all of the salmon orienting towards the ish. But the really astonishing feature of this is the reflection upon the fact that this is a location that is also shared with others. In this case, it's with birds, and the form behind that you see is in fact the representation of a bear. So all of us humans, salmon, birds, and bears orient towards the ish. And here's a close-up of that particular. So what are the images? Why these images? Again, it is a statement about the nature of existence. Here you can see the bear claws a little more clearly. So I want to just briefly here in closing talk about how this principle of relational sustainability and the return of this, the moral obligation of human beings to engage in activities that will ensure that is positioned in other kinds of activities. So here I was out in Yakutat Bay at the far north end of Tlingit territory, documenting seal hunting amongst those Tlingit in the glacier and the icebergs of that area. And this young man, David Ramus, happened to be the cameraman in there. He killed this seal, and so when he pulled the seal into the skiff, he positioned it so that the head of the seal was tilted over the gunnel and facing down into the water. This was brought to my attention several years later that I had this footage, because it was only several years later, in which this activity that you'll see depicted in these two pictures occurred, that I was able to reconstruct what I had just seen before. So this is another important methodological point, to continuously return to various different instances and occasions to relearn. And that's in fact a Tlingit principle of education, is for when you're young, you are taught to remember these things so that you can return to them and draw on them in the future. Now, I went out with Von Siskane to hunt sea otter. And this again is participant observation. And he came upon a raft of them, and he was able to kill several of them. And then we went around and he picked them out of the water. And he pulled each one out of the water. And as you see in the picture on the right, that is how they are positioned. Once again, the positioning is for the head to be over the gunnel. As I sat back in the stern by Vaughn then, and I was looking out over that, I saw a rigor action of a last pulsation of the muscles of the animal as it went through its dying process, the rigor. And I asked Vaughn, what was that? And he says, that is when the spirit of the sea otter returns back so that it can be reborn. And at that point, then he would pull the sea otter into the skiff so that we could then go on and pick up the others. So these principles are alive and out there. These kinds of activities are the ways in which I've been able to experience, and I hope learn from Tlingit people around these activities. So with that note, I end my presentation, and if there's time, I can certainly try to answer questions, but Ty, or you'll have to relay them to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Langdon, for the wonderful presentation. So yeah, let's have about a couple minutes of questions so that we can still get to Dr. Meyers. Anybody in the room?
Ask a question?
Yep, Dr. Lucero has a question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. How has your decades of observation of the traditions of these peoples, how has this changed the way you see your relationship to nature?
Well, I certainly can never attain the habitus that I see, but the opportunities to be with them, to experience the relationality that they have, certainly has given me far more understanding and attention to other co-occupants of nature in terms of the communication and the ability to orient in a way that how is communication going on here. That's something that's completely outside of the American habitus that members of the society are given. And so it certainly has made an enormous influence on that, and also in terms of the respect for the characteristics of each of these other being forms that are out there. They're no longer animals in that sense, or fish. They're beings that I do take on that sensibility, that aspect of the existence scape has infused me, yeah.
Hi there. Wanted to ask if the local people we work with have any opinions about like tourists doing fishing. I know that sort of ecotourism, fishing on boats and whatnot is very popular in Alaska, and that's not for sustenance necessarily, and it's such different methods. So what do people think about that?
Well, some guys have become some Tlingit that I know have become fishing guides on some of these boats that you are discussing, and they're not particularly comfortable. It's a job, but just listening to them talk about the cultural encounters, they really don't like to be around people engaging in those kinds of activities. And then there's a second level, which are there's lots of their resources that are being taken out of the areas by those activities. But I want to speak to one other aspect of what you're talking about, and this shows this incredible budding of heads of the existence-scapes. The idea that you play with another being is beyond them. You don't play with things, okay? And so the idea of catch and release is anathema. How can you play with this other being and release it? So this, from the vantage point of certain types of American fishermen or Western fishermen, this is a wonderful conservation activity that they're engaging in. To the vantage point of an indigenous Alaskan, this is a violation of fundamental principles of the valuation of relationship and the beingness of others. So there are lots of problematics in those activities in terms of their intersections for Tlingit people.
We have a question from a virtual attendee. Incredible knowledge. After rebuilding knowledge about the practices from before the 1920s through your interviews, are these practices being used again?
The problem is that much of the harvesting of salmon occurs out in the distant waters, which in the past, all of the salmon came to the streams. And so these practices are in fact why when the American industry arrived, there were these enormous salmon runs. Okay, all of these things. I wanted to build a model about them, a mathematical model based upon these principles that the Tlingit used. But no, they can't use these principles anymore. They were outlawed. The intertidal fish traps were outlawed in 1889, basically by a U.S. law that said you can't have any impediments in the intertidal zone. And that was because the white men were building barricades across the streams and to completely halt salmon going up the streams. They had, I mean, biologists walked across these estuaries for literally 100 years, never went over to talk to a Tlingit about it, never investigated themselves, never had a thought about them. So the idea that they can be rejuvenated is really unfortunate that it can't happen, but that's the way in which history has taken its course with regard to these mechanisms. Now, I know down in British Columbia, on the Comox River outside of Nanaimo, they are in fact reconstituted, which has an extraordinary estuarine context. The woman Nancy Green, who did the work based upon her understandings of my work on the intertidal zone, found these extraordinary structures in the mud of the intertidal. And those people are trying to rejuvenate their traditional practices. But in southeastern Alaska, it is not going to take place. They are rebuilding clam beds or clam gardens, as they are called. That's another structure of intertidal construction to create beds where clams can be beneficial. But returning to these techniques for the utilization and actually, I'll make one comment. The colleague that you saw there, Thomas Mills, on the Neva River doing the gaffing, once this report came out, he was approached by the Forest Service to go back and do screamscaping with them. So there was at some point in time some interest in using Tlingit principles of knowledge about how to streamscape, but I don't know how far that particular initiative ever went.
Okay, we have another online question. After the Seattle AAA meetings, there were Tlingit grad students. Are you aware of any of them viewing your work?
Oh, I don't know if without the names. Lots of there's an they know my work in British Columbia. I'm amongst graduate students. Elroy White's used my work in reconstructing Heiltsuk intertidal fish traps, and it's known amongst the Kitkatla Tsimshian. But there's an exhibit that is at the Sobolov Center, the Cultural Heritage Center in Juneau, that has those drone videos and the depiction of certainly the intertidal. I don't believe we didn't do an exhibit on basis of the ish, which I think would be another very powerful one. But no, I don't know. I'm not aware with regard to those specifics.
Okay, I think that's probably as much time as we have for questions for you, Stephen, and I really appreciate it. It was a great presentation. Thank you again.
Okay, good luck to everyone.
Thank you. Okay, so we're about to start with our second speaker, who is Dr. Richard Meyers. He's the former Director of Graduate Studies and Associate Professor at Oglala Lakota College, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. As an Oglala Lakota Sioux tribal member, he is one of a small group of federally recognized tribal members to achieve a Ph.D. within the anthropology discipline. Meyers has had a long and satisfying journey off the reservation pursuing his education. He holds a master's and Ph.D. in anthropology from Arizona State, as well as a master's degree in English from Breadloaf School of English at Middlebury College in Vermont. At South Dakota State University, my alma mater, he served as Director of Tribal Outreach to the President, was Program Coordinator of the American Indian Studies, and served as Assistant to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences on matters of inclusion, diversity, and equity. Meyers has served as a writer for the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs under both Bush and Obama administrations, and was a fellow in the Anthropology Department at the Smithsonian. He's a member of the Executive Board of the Association of Indigenous Anthropologists, among a few boards he sits upon. He currently works for the Black Hills National Forest as the Tribal Relations Specialist, and he lives with his wife and two daughters on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the Eagles Nest District. Thank you so much for joining us, Richie. I've known Richie for a few years now, so it's great to have him here, or virtually at least.
Thank you, Ty. I guess I'm up in Custer at the supervisor's office for the forest unit here in Custer, South Dakota. I guess the introduction all sounds fancy and all that, but on the ground reality, I commute between my community in Wombly as the easternmost part of Pine Ridge Reservation. It used to be Rosebud Reservation till about 1907. And then it petitioned to be a part of Pine Ridge. But it's about a 2.5 to 3 hour drive, depending on how much I break the law and the speed. I stay up here in Custer a couple days out of the week and telework some other days, but a lot of my working logistics are in motion, so to speak. So I deal with 16 tribal nations that are officially affiliated with the Black Hills National Forest. The site is sort of unique in that the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 was determined in 1980 by the Supreme Court to have been violated by the United States. So the tribes have never relinquished title to this land. So all the federal land up here is in an interesting spot contingent to which political administration is from the president level down. So I rejoined federal service after leaving academe this past summer, and I think I started here the last week of August in the forest. The forest USFS, or United States Forestry, is often confused at times by the tribes as the Park Service, and they wear green uniforms, and apparently I don't have to wear mine because I'm not really doing any cool stuff. I'm a desk jockey mostly. But the long and the short of it is it's a unique spot, probably one of the most unique in the country for the forest, just because of that treaty. And right now, under the Biden administration, there's a tremendous push under a secretarial order from USDA and Department of Interior to really uphold sovereignty and co-stewardship opportunities so that the tribes are trying to get involved with the management of the federal lands here. That's on a large level. I'm the, as some of the tribes were teasing me, and some of the elders from the Treaty Council were teasing and saying, Rich, you're the token. Just know if things go bad, they're throwing you under the bus. And then if it goes good, no one's going to give you credit. And I said, no, I'm well aware of that. I'm I'm used to the federal government. But in my role as the tribal relations specialist here at the forest, if it's got natives involved in some sense, I'm the go-to guy. So I somewhat answer all sorts of random things. This morning, I was at a college career fair at the Crazy Horse Mountain. And for any of you who are aware of the state of South Dakota, there's the Black Hills, which I would say are the prettiest part of South Dakota. There's the Corn Palace in Mitchell. East side of the state versus west side, there's always jokes about that. But long story short, the whole idea of what does it mean to work in the Black Hills, which the tribes have never relinquished. There's urban spots, there's all sorts of people. This morning, tribal schools were at Crazy Horse Mountain. Crazy Horse Mountain is a mountain owned by a Polish family that has tried to make a statue of a man who wanted no pictures or anything of him. So there's the origins are already sort of interesting to begin with. You have Crazy Horse, the historical figure who, did not want to be captured in an image. And then you have a Polish sculptor trying to carve probably the largest sculpture in existence out of a mountain of the man who didn't want that. So there's a lot of interesting relationships in the state of South Dakota. The state itself has Custer State Park, which is right imbued in the national park here, but they have names like Squaw Valley, Squaw Road. They haven't changed in the state world, but in the federal world, the name squaw is considered derogatory, like a cuss word, and some people won't even say the word squaw, they'll say the S word. My background in terms of language and sociolinguistics means I like to tease a lot, and half of the things I say aren't serious. And so it's been a while to deliver, I guess, an educated perspective with gobbledygook neologisms as to stuff. When Stephen was presenting on ish, my mind went to the contemporary this and that and ish. And I guess ish in a contemporary vernacular is SHIT. So although it's from the Tlingit language, it's always interesting as hybridity kind of flows through American culture. So vantage point wise, I'm an anthropologist, but I'm considered to be a native anthropologist, which is an awkward predicament because the notion of objectively studying human beings, what happens when you're speaking about your own said culture group? There's so many, writings and deconstructions of what that means, but I went to graduate school in the Southwest, worked with Navajos and Cocopa tribe predominantly, and Yaquis. Apparently, I helped on Yaqui publications and research. But I came home to what I consider home as my allotment is in the Wombly area. My dad is an Irish Catholic guy, and the name Meyers is German. So somebody left Germany and roamed to Ireland. But he met my mom in the 70s. My mom is from a first language Lakota speaking family, sort of highly involved in ceremony and traditional knowledge. And so my life was told to me as Yurinayeska, and that word has all sorts of different meanings. Again, going between English and a tribal language, you have concepts. The concept is like a translator. It's also used in the modern vernacular as a half breed because dad's white and mom's a Lakota. They didn't work out in terms of their marriage. So I have 7 siblings all spread in different realities. They're all female. So people think I was the only male with 7 sisters, but that's an oversimplification of my older sister's 5 years older than me. And technically she was adopted by my parents and she's actually my first cousin, and her kids became my sister's sister. It gets all complicated. But as far as narrating, I guess you could say ethnographic snapshots. What does it mean to take a picture and description of a spot, a cultural spot that is not always weighable and measurable in a scientific narrative, but requires nuancing language to describe something? Um, I uh, I was gonna say when I was asking, so my mind's still very much attuned to the presentation before me here, and so there was some angry Tlingit youth graduate students who were not pleased with the discipline of anthropology or outsiders having observations of their respective cultures. And I'm not Tlingit. I've met folks in the DC area and folks who worked for National Congress of American Indians who said they were Tlingit. And again, that idea of the vantage point of narrating culture. What is this? Who is it interesting to? If it's interesting to a bunch of people who are outsiders, what is it like if you're both an insider and an outsider? You've been in your tribal community, you've been in mainstream America, you fuse together globalization, the internet, and all sorts of things. It's an interesting time for anthropology in that regard. But my chair, she's up there in age, so I had to order her book from Amazon to prep for this talk because I would have normally just said send me a PDF, but she's hit some kind of obstacles that don't afford her communication in the fullest. Her work, when I was a grad student for her in Arizona, was spread all over as an applied anthropologist, but she was non-native from Florida. As a female doing field work in the 60s, she used to carry a big Magnum, like that Dirty Harry style Magnum in her purse. I thought that was interesting. She was a really interesting lady. She spoke Apache, Spanish, and English. But I ended up completing my dissertation work under her, and the conversations we used to have regarded the secrecy of knowledge, and it's a body of literature which, as she was writing, was pertaining to the Taos Pueblo and Pueblo people in general. So again, the idea of getting through a discipline where the discipline of anthropology has had a multitude of internal, as they call it, navel gazing debates about objectivity, representation, the politics of identity and representation. So those things said, the conversations I had with my former chair on the secrecy of knowledge really made me gravitate towards her to complete my graduate studies in anthropology. That idea that, I used to tease and say at the most crass basic level, you don't want to teach a 12-year-old who's gone through puberty and likes to smack people's ears and pinch people how to do the death touch in kung fu or whatever. The idea of knowledge is supposed to be afforded to those who are ready to handle that obligation. And so in today's age, you can bypass things, go to the internet, look and examine knowledge, see information. There's an overabundance of it. Doesn't mean you can actually get an education in the sense of there's no need for education anymore because the internet exists. But all that aside, the idea of philosophical distinctions between what does it mean to know things, what does it mean to not talk about certain things, and what should be revealed. And so the kind of conversation I wanted to toss at you guys without knowing fully, I've seen 2 to 3 of these things, and One was driving through Porcupine with shoddy reception. I've had shoddy reception as I'm driving, but it was a pleasure to just briefly glimpse at some of the topics you guys have covered in here. But that notion again of let's preserve these cultures, let's understand and save this knowledge. It'll help mainstream America, which is degrading the environment at high levels, and the environment's going downhill, et cetera, et cetera. Indigenous people obviously were in a different relationship, and I think pulling from Stephen's talk, the idea of relationality, or however you want to frame that. In Lakota, for instance, oyate, that word, sometimes people will say, are you working for the oyate? Are you working for the people? Well, that's one translation, but you could say the Wamakashka oyate, the animal nation, the insect nation. You could say the bird nation. Everything is on a kind of equal parallel oyate status. Ants, bugs, fish, birds, the hierarchical arborescent schema of, I always think of some of those movies where they say God, core, country. The chain of being is what it's referred to as formally. But do you have a higher power, and below that on a scheme is things of lesser? So I can eat on the food chain cows because they weren't doing nothing and they don't feel it. Or I can eat fish because, the arguments are interesting in modern America as to rationalizing being a vegetarian, a vegan, or whatever the combination of different possibilities are. But that idea of you are one among many nations on this planet and you all have purpose. But yeah, sometimes you got to eat something. So my grandma really loved dog, or puppy. It was called Shunkawahampi. My older sister used to say, she'd try to tell my grandma, don't eat this puppy, it's my puppy. And so she was worried when she was at school if grandma was going to eat her puppy. Sometimes she just did. and those dogs loved her, mind you. It's like living on a farm or being a rancher. If you're friends with the cows, but someday it's going to be a cheeseburger, your relationship to that animal and the balance of being an animal yourself, it's understood that you have to have a balance or an ontological disposition, all sorts of fancy English words, narratives. But when you get into secrecy of knowledge, as I was, reading back up and visiting some of the conversations I had with my chair back in the day, there's a lot of divergent paths, secrecy versus privacy, right? What's secret and what's private? If I go eat at your guys' houses and I the next day divulge everything in your family and how your dad or mother was, or your auntie, or start telling people your business, that idea of, well, we invited you over, it was intimate, why are you telling everybody? That the idea of what is secret, what is private, that terminology apparently really affects what is there. What my chair had examined in Pueblo society, and another anthropologist named B. Medicine, and a Pueblo man himself named Alfonso Ortiz. He was a Pueblo anthropologist. I think he finished at Princeton and died when I was graduating my undergraduate. He was banished and ostracized from his people for writing the Tewa World in 1969. It was an excellent, accurate account of his people and their ceremonies. In doing so, his community, again, ostracized him because why? Well, that's where this whole concept of you're not supposed to tell things to people. Not everybody is supposed to know everything. So you can think about confidentiality. Both Trump and Biden are in hot water for bringing emails home from work and whatnot. As a Fed, you have to take all these tests all the time on cyber awareness and whatnot. So to not know that they're pretty guilty, you don't take work onto your private stuff. It's different rules. But the long and the short of some of that is, what does it mean to explore tribal people and want to save plants and understand things? Well, some of those elders will be very willing to share with you because they know when they pass, they won't have someone to record it. So they want someone to keep it for posterity. But at the same time, some of them aren't aware that someone's taking your knowledge and they're commodifying it, which means they're monetizing it. They're, I would say, weaponizing it as a commodity. And once that happens, the secrecy aspect goes downhill. So Pueblo people on the surface have maintained Christianity for, since the Spanish have been there, due to overt power and literally gun to your head type transformations. But that didn't mean that they didn't go underground with their ceremonies, and they're very strict. So strict that you have to promise never to talk about certain things. Brothers can't talk to each other about ceremony they did if they're in different kivas. So there's a really fascinating thing about secrecy in those tribes, and that's where, again, the body of literature is. I found that fascinating, but never wrote about it, and still not sure I would write about it, because exactly what I'm telling you, I don't want to be ostracized from my community. I don't want to be on the outside of ceremony as Alfonso Ortiz used to be, because they didn't let him into the ceremonies as a native anymore. He was out with the tourists trying to figure out, what are the Indians doing? Well, that's a real interesting kind of conversation just to insert. But some of the questions out there are there different forms of secrecy? Do they have different social and political functions? Who collaborates in keeping secrets and why? What are the dangers of disclosure? Under what circumstances do outsiders employ espionage to discover secrets? What procedures are used to protect secrets? Under what circumstances does secrecy prove to be dysfunctional to an organization or a community? So again, keeping secrets, and then lo and behold, all of your elders die and nobody knows them, and you're looking to anthropologists for the answer. That's been a historical phenomena. But I guess, that's some of the stuff I just wanted to bring to the table, where my grandpa and his grandpa was given permission when the rest of the country wasn't allowed to do ceremony. They invited my great-great-grandpa to the White House to perform ceremony. And so he was allowed to when others weren't in the state of South Dakota. That's the same medicine man to Crazy Horse. His name is, in English, Chips. The idea of who descends from him and his two wives and where we fit in that in the community of Wombly. There are things that people want to know but can't. There are ceremonies for songs that are proprietary. So at this moment, there are people who are Lakotas who think because they're Lakota, they get to know everything. Or they go to the internet, or they want to read a book that tells them things. Well, if you didn't learn it from the human being who apprentices with you, are you worthy of knowing that? Those are all really interesting issues. And with the ethnobotany world and whatnot, if it's out there in the book, is my rule of thumb is if somebody already uncovered it and exposed it, then I'm cool with talking about it. But there are things that not my place to talk about. And who shares things as culture is commodified. You have a lot of people in one of the Anthropology 101s is the people who are most vocal and really out there for contracts on culture are usually the least knowledgeable. And the ones who don't want to talk to you, they know the most. So in terms of explaining things for folks and outsiders versus insiders and outsiders, and as culture continuously moves forward in this globalized world we share, some of these things on right now in the government, I believe Stephen kind of alluded to it, but steered clear of it. Is it traditional ecological knowledge we're talking about, or in the White House terms, it's traditional knowledge? They're saying TK, so it has bearing upon my little typings of acronyms. I'm like, so am I writing TK or TEK, and what is it? Those, I guess, are just, some of the larger issues of consideration when discussing tribal interests, tribal societies, and secrecy. And so just was throwing that towards you guys and figured we could have a good back and forth, assuming no one has like a weed whacker going on in the background or something.
Yeah, I think that's, you're bringing up a lot of very philosophical points when you're talking about how anthropologists or even ecologists are going about working with tribes. You know what it made me think of is, as an anthropologist coming into a community, I think about how my wife doesn't let anybody come over when our house is dirty. We have to, clean up the house, make it look all perfect. So sometimes I would think that if you know that there's people coming to observe you, you might be changing some of the things that you're doing in the first place. So we might not be even be getting an accurate representation of what people are doing. Do you think that that's appropriate to think?
I that's one of the axioms of anthropological training is there's what people say, what people do, and what people wish they did. Oftentimes they tell you what they wish they did. They don't actually do it. And so it's really fascinating nowadays when people will say, in my culture, we do this. And I'm like, I saw you at Taco John's and you weren't doing nothing. And so there is an ontological difference for sure. But sometimes the people most vocal about being that and saying, like I always find a Lakota virtue is humility. And so there's this guy on the internet saying, I'm humble. And it's like, you're yelling at me that you're humble. Do you not see the weird contradiction in what you're screaming at me about? Like, I'm humble. It's just kind of like an oxymoronic statement of sorts. Yeah, it is something that when you do examination of cultures and people and populations and communities, you're trying to get authentic testimony, and that word authentic is problematic right from the get-go. People know it's an interview. Is there money? What's the circumstances for the interview? Is it a survey instrument? What are we talking about? How is it being shared? Does the person want to be written up and known for it? Right now, politics-wise, there's a fellow member Dances with Wolves, Nathan Chasing Horse. What I'm saying is public, so I'm not worried about him coming after me and being angry. But he smiles a lot and dances with wolves. He became a medicine man, arguably in his own mind, but then he got a following. The reporters are calling, and I farmed them off to people in the community who have that right to speak from a first-person narrative. And he was banished for having 7 wife children. So for sex trafficking and abuse of minors and all sorts of wacky stuff. But in response to that, a group of medicine people and treaty council up here in South Dakota are going to, instead of talk about him and how he's not, they're going to talk more so towards what does it mean to be a keeper of traditional knowledge, ceremony, and other things? What are the burdens and responsibilities? And by doing that, it leaves you with the ability to sort of go, that person don't seem to match what they're saying you need to do and uphold. And so it's one of those cultural protocols where culturally everything is indirect discourse, and you disagree with someone, you really want to blow them out of the water. And, whether you're in a classroom or something and they're saying something and you have evidence in front of you to another testament that shows theirs is wacky, you're trained to go, actually, your logic is flawed. In Lakota protocols, you don't correct someone, even when they're blatantly wrong. You gently do it, and you do it indirectly, or you tell your cousin to correct them, or your sibling to correct them, but it's not one-to-one correction. And yet there are people raised in different ways culturally where they weren't raised that way, so they come after you directly, and they're on Facebook, or there's so many variations of culture right now that it's just a fascinating time, because for some people these things and these practices and these understandings, like an example that I think is very relevant to this discussion is sweetgrass and sage. In the summers, people will be selling it on the main streets of Pine Ridge and the reservation when tourists are going through, and they're selling it $4 to $8 a bundle. And when you see it, they pulled it out of the ground. They didn't cut it. So there's been a shortage of sage growing on different spots because people weren't taught or raised to do that. And same with timsila digging. You're supposed to do and harvest in a certain way so that each season it replenishes. If you over harvest or you don't do it right, you kill things. And so because it's a commodity, people have, so to speak, bastardized the system in place of knowledge. And in many cases, it's not their fault. They weren't raised in that kind of household, and they didn't have a Lakota studies class at their high school or whatnot. And so sometimes they're really seeking and hungry and thirsty for cultural knowledge. And that's where, again, these kind of cultural locutors or interlocutors are there, and they do culture workshops, and people in the community, some giggle, some go, oh, and it's an interesting time.
Any questions or comments in the room? Sarah, if there's anybody online that would like to discuss or?
Yeah, and in fact, I think everyone has the capability to unmute themselves if they do want to verbally ask a question or comment.
Or everybody might be in that pizza mode. Is it pizza time? No.
Can I just like, so I worked right after my undergrad, I was working with IUCN to document like Indigenous knowledge on biodiversity conservation. So we had issues to document the actual knowledge part of it. As you also pointed out, like community members were not very willing to share what they knew. And looking at that project 18 years from now, it's already been 18 years. So there are these registers that we prepared that are with the local authority, but I try to do some follow-ups, and I don't think people are just using it for any purposes. I mean, not that it has to be used, just having the knowledge is a good thing, of course. But I was just trying to think ask about your experience of how, like in communities like that, where yes, it is there, but nobody really cares a lot about it because it's kind of already modernized. Only a few older people care that there is knowledge out there in this reality of where we live right now. What do you think, like, those kind of knowledge could be used, or how could those already documented knowledge could be used? I don't know.
So I was going to say, I'm going to sidestep your question and semi-answer it, maybe, but you'll have to let me know. So there's a thing that the tribes have called a THPO, a THPO, a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Not all the tribes have them funded. There's a national NATHPO, NATHPO, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. I attended their meeting this year in Cherokee, North Carolina, and there was a San Carlos Apache woman, and she was freaked out by the conference. And conferences all have their cultural conference culture going on. But the tribes that are present, some of them are in varying degrees and capacities in terms of, how would you say, where are they at with their language? If it's really in decline, and when the language is in decline, it's safe to assume that ecological and cultural knowledge in those terms are often following suit. There are people, at those meetings who really have cool, like, I don't know if you've seen Pawnee Warriors, like that Dances with Wolves. He was a Cherokee guy, but the shaved head and like a warrior look. There was a guy in his 70s, and it was interesting because people are trying to bring back facial tattoos, all sorts of cultural elements. And they're usually from tribes that were decimated, arguably, with their cultural loss. Some of the cultures that are still got a language and whatnot, you'll see them wearing a Washington Redskins or Cleveland Indians hat, and they're doing the opposite or the anti-assumption of what you'd think is pro-Indian. But the kind of approach to your question that brings up the THPO conversation is each of these tribes and their responsibility, whether it's bringing bodies back from Carlisle Indian School and trying to reapproach that ceremonial knowledge. It's a formalized governmental approach. So we deal at the forest and the Park Service as well all the time with the tribal historic preservation officers. Stateside, they have SHPOs, state historical preservation officers, who are usually archaeologists. They have perspectives, but if you don't have the tribe's perspective, That whole Standing Rock issue came down to a lot of things. But those TIPOs also have a secrecy rule and code within them. They don't want to do ethnographic studies. They don't want the Air Force, they don't want the feds to know certain things because they believe that if they do, they'll abuse it, they'll appropriate it, they'll desecrate sites as they did during the Standing Rock thing and bulldoze it. Yeah, so getting people interested in the past, for our respective area here in the Lakota space, and South Dakota in general, there is I guess an intentional attempt to try to reinvigorate and revitalize and really bring together that interest through. Some folks are killing buffalo and skinning and tanning hides and doing things that I wouldn't consider to be college work, but they're getting credit at the tribal colleges for that type of knowledge. And it's an interesting time because there is such rapid cultural decay. And, keeping my daughters off of their tablets and the internet, it's a challenge. But yeah, so like I said, it's more of a side answer, which is the tribes do have capacity and formalized positions to try to, I guess, approach that strategically, what you're asking.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.